Sometimes the most powerful stories are written not in books but on skin. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes walk among us, carrying their battles as permanent reminders of where they've been and who they've become. In a world where first impressions often become lasting judgments, where appearances can make or break careers, and where stereotypes run deeper than we'd like to admit, one young woman was about to prove that strength comes in forms we never expect. This is the story of how a single tattoo changed everything, not just for one person, but for an entire military base that learned never to judge a book by its cover. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete grounds of Fort Braxton as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the transport vehicle, her standard-issue duffel bag slung over one shoulder. At 23 years old, she was exactly what you'd expect from a new military recruit, except for the parts of her story that nobody could see. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, her uniform pressed to perfection, and her posture spoke of someone who had already learned discipline long before entering military service. Fort Braxton was known throughout the military community as one of the most challenging training facilities in the country. The base housed approximately 3,000 active personnel, from fresh recruits like Sarah to seasoned veterans who had served multiple tours overseas. The facility sprawled across several hundred acres of North Carolina landscape, featuring everything from basic training grounds to advanced tactical training centers. It was here that soldiers were made, where boys and girls became men and women capable of defending their country. Sarah's arrival had been anticipated by the training staff, though not necessarily with enthusiasm. Her file had preceded her, and while her physical fitness scores were impressive and her academic record stellar, there was something about her that made the veteran drill sergeants exchange knowing glances. Perhaps it was her age, or maybe it was the fact that she came from a civilian background, with no prior military family connections. In their experience, recruits like Sarah often struggled with the harsh realities of military life. Staff Sergeant Williams, a man whose weathered face told stories of 3 decades in service, was assigned as Sarah's primary training supervisor. He had seen hundreds of recruits pass through these gates, and he prided himself on being able to spot the ones who would make it and those who would wash out within the first few weeks. As he watched Sarah walking toward the barracks, carrying herself with quiet confidence, he made a mental note to keep a close eye on this one. The other recruits in Sarah's unit were a mixed group, typical of what Fort Braxton saw each training cycle. There was Marcus Johnson from Detroit, a former college athlete whose physical prowess was immediately obvious. Jennifer Walsh came from a military family and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up around service members. Tommy Richardson was barely 18, fresh out of high school, and still adjusting to being away from home for the first time. These 3, along with 15 others, would form Sarah's training unit for the next several months. From the moment Sarah introduced herself to her fellow recruits, she could sense the subtle evaluations taking place. In military training, first impressions carry significant weight because these are the people you might one day depend on in life or death situations. Sarah's quiet demeanor and unremarkable appearance led many to assume she would be one of the weaker links in their unit. She wasn't the tallest, strongest, or most obviously athletic member of the group, and her soft-spoken nature was often mistaken for timidity. The first few days of training followed predictable patterns. Wake-up calls at 4:30 in the morning, followed by physical training that pushed every recruit to their limits. Sarah performed adequately in most exercises, never excelling enough to draw positive attention, but never falling behind enough to earn serious criticism. She completed her runs within acceptable times, managed the obstacle courses without major difficulties, and followed instructions precisely. To most observers, she appeared to be exactly what she seemed, an average recruit doing her best to keep up. During mealtimes and brief periods of downtime, the natural social hierarchies began to emerge within the unit. Marcus quickly established himself as an unofficial leader among the recruits, his athletic background and natural charisma drawing others to follow his lead. Jennifer's military knowledge made her a valuable resource for practical advice about navigating training requirements. Tommy's youth and enthusiasm, while sometimes annoying to the others, provided comic relief during particularly stressful moments. Sarah, meanwhile, remained somewhat apart from these developing social dynamics. She was friendly enough when directly engaged in conversation, but she rarely initiated social interactions and seemed content to observe rather than participate in the casual bonding that typically occurred among new recruits. Some interpreted this as aloofness, others as shyness, but none of them considered that she might be carrying experiences that made casual friendship feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. The training regimen at Fort Braxton was designed to break down civilian thinking patterns and rebuild them according to military standards. Physical training was only one component of this transformation. recruits attended classes on military history, weapons handling, first aid, and tactical procedures. They learned to march in formation, to follow complex chains of command, and to function as cohesive units rather than collections of individuals. Every aspect of their daily lives was structured to reinforce these lessons. Sarah approached these academic and procedural aspects of training with the same quiet competence she displayed during physical activities. Her test scores consistently placed her in the upper portion of her class, and she demonstrated excellent retention of complex procedures and protocols. Her instructors noted her ability to remain calm under pressure and her tendency to ask thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than mere memorization. However, it was during the practical application exercises that some of Sarah's fellow recruits began to notice something different about her approach to training. When they practiced first aid procedures, Sarah's hands moved with a steadiness that suggested prior experience with medical emergencies. During weapons safety instruction, she demonstrated familiarity with firearms that went beyond what most civilian recruits possessed. These small indicators might have raised questions in different circumstances, but the demanding pace of training left little time for curiosity about fellow recruits' backgrounds. Staff Sergeant Williams began to take particular notice of Sarah during the third week of training. While she never stood out for exceptional performance in any single area, her overall consistency was remarkable. She made fewer mistakes than most recruits, required less correction of basic procedures, and demonstrated an ability to adapt quickly to new challenges. More importantly, she seemed to possess an inner steadiness that many recruits lacked during the early stages of their military transformation. One evening, after a particularly challenging day that had included a 12-mile march followed by tactical exercises, Williams found himself observing the recruits as they prepared for evening chow. Most were exhausted, their movements showing the fatigue that comes from being pushed beyond normal civilian limits. Sarah, however, moved through her post-exercise routine with methodical efficiency, her energy levels seeming less depleted than those around her. It was a small thing, but experienced trainers learned to notice such details. The social dynamics within Sarah's unit continued to evolve as training progressed. Marcus maintained his position as the unofficial leader, but cracks were beginning to show in his confidence as the training intensified. Jennifer's military knowledge proved invaluable, but her sometimes condescending attitude toward recruits from non-military backgrounds created tension. Tommy's initial enthusiasm was being tested by the physical and mental demands of training, leaving him struggling to maintain his positive outlook. Through all of these interpersonal developments, Sarah remained a steady presence. She helped struggling unit members without being asked, shared her rations when others forgot to pack sufficient food for field exercises, and demonstrated reliability that was becoming increasingly valuable to her fellow recruits. Yet despite these positive contributions, she remained something of an enigma to those around her. The fourth week of training brought the first major test of unit cohesion. The recruits were assigned a complex field exercise that required them to work together to accomplish multiple objectives under time pressure, while being observed and evaluated by their training staff. The exercise was designed to identify natural leaders, expose weaknesses in teamwork, and push recruits beyond their individual comfort zones. Sarah's performance during this exercise marked the first time she truly stood out from her peers. While others struggled with the stress of being evaluated or became overwhelmed by the complexity of their assigned tasks, Sarah moved through the exercise with calm efficiency. She anticipated problems before they became critical, offered solutions without undermining designated leaders, and demonstrated tactical thinking that surprised her instructors. Most notably, when Tommy Richardson suffered a panic attack midway through the exercise, freezing up during a simulated combat scenario, Sarah was the first to reach him. Her response was immediate and professional, employing breathing techniques and grounding exercises that quickly helped Tommy regain his composure. Her intervention was so smooth and effective that the exercise continued without significant delay, but the incident left several observers wondering where a civilian recruit had learned such advanced crisis intervention techniques. After the exercise concluded, Staff Sergeant Williams made a note in Sarah's file about her performance, particularly her leadership potential and her apparent experience with high-stress situations. However, he also noted questions about her background that he felt warranted further investigation. The combination of her tactical thinking, medical knowledge, and crisis management skills suggested experiences that weren't reflected in her official recruitment records. That evening, as the recruits gathered in the barracks to decompress from the day's activities, the atmosphere was different than usual. The successful completion of their first major group exercise had created a sense of accomplishment and growing unit cohesion. For the first time since training began, Sarah found herself at the center of positive attention from her fellow recruits. with several thanking her for her help during the exercise and acknowledging her contributions to their collective success. Marcus approached Sarah directly, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. "I don't know what your story is," he said, "but you've got skills that go beyond what they teach in basic training. Thanks for having our backs out there today." Jennifer nodded in agreement, adding, "Whatever your background is, we're lucky to have you in our unit." Even Tommy, still somewhat shaken from his panic attack, managed to express his gratitude for Sarah's assistance. Sarah accepted their thanks with characteristic modesty, deflecting attention away from herself and redirecting praise toward the team's overall performance. However, those closest to her during the conversation noticed something they hadn't observed before, a subtle change in her posture and bearing that suggested their recognition meant more to her than she was willing to express verbally. As the evening progressed and the recruits prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events. For the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, she felt like she might truly belong in this environment. The successful exercise had validated her decision to pursue military service, and the growing acceptance from her unit members offered hope that she could build the kind of meaningful relationships that had been so difficult to maintain in her civilian life. However, Sarah was also aware that her performance during the exercise had raised questions that she wasn't yet ready to answer. The experiences that had prepared her for military training were not experiences she was comfortable sharing with people who were still essentially strangers. The skills that made her effective as a soldier came from a past that was both her greatest source of strength and her most carefully guarded secret. Staff Sergeant Williams spent part of that evening reviewing Sarah's file, comparing her official records with his observations of her performance. The inconsistencies were becoming more apparent with each passing day of training. Her tactical awareness, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience all suggested someone with prior military or law enforcement experience. Yet her records indicated no such background. He made a mental note to request additional background information from the recruitment office, though he suspected that whatever had shaped Sarah Martinez into the recruit he was observing might not be reflected in any official documentation. The 5th week of training at Fort Braxton brought with it a series of specialized instruction modules designed to test recruits in areas beyond basic physical and tactical skills. These modules included advanced first aid certification, weapons maintenance workshops, and psychological resilience training. It was during these more technical aspects of military preparation that Sarah's unusual competencies became impossible to ignore. The first indication that Sarah possessed knowledge beyond typical civilian experience came during the advanced first aid certification course. The instruction was led by Sergeant Rebecca Torres, a medic with 15 years of field experience who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Torres had developed a reputation for being able to quickly identify recruits who had potential for medical specialization within the military, as well as those who might struggle with the realities of treating battlefield injuries. The course began with standard procedures for treating common injuries and medical emergencies. Most recruits approached these lessons with the awkward uncertainty typical of people learning unfamiliar skills under pressure. They fumbled with bandages, hesitated over proper positioning for various medical procedures, and required multiple demonstrations before achieving competency with basic techniques. Sarah's approach to the medical training was markedly different. When Torres demonstrated proper technique for treating tension pneumothorax, Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she followed along. Her improvised chest seal was properly positioned and secured with professional efficiency. When the lesson moved to controlling severe bleeding, Sarah's tourniquet application was textbook perfect on her first attempt. Most telling, however, was her reaction to the graphic training materials depicting various battlefield injuries. She showed no signs of the squeamishness that affected most of her fellow recruits. Sergeant Torres began watching Sarah more closely as the medical training progressed. During a practical exercise involving simulated mass casualty events, Sarah demonstrated triage skills that suggested familiarity with prioritizing multiple patients under chaotic conditions. She moved efficiently between patients, making quick but accurate assessments about severity of injuries and appropriate immediate interventions. Her performance was not just competent, it was professional. After the day's medical training concluded, Torres approached Staff Sergeant Williams with her observations. "That Martinez recruit," she said, "she's not learning this material. She already knows it. Someone has trained her in advanced trauma care, and recently enough that the skills are still sharp. Her technique is too polished for someone who's never worked on real patients." Williams nodded thoughtfully, adding Torres's observations to his growing list of questions about Sarah's background. The medical skills combined with her tactical awareness and crisis management abilities painted a picture of someone with significant practical experience in high-stress, potentially dangerous situations. Yet nothing in her recruitment file suggested any formal training that would account for such expertise. The weapons maintenance workshop that followed the medical training provided additional evidence of Sarah's unusual background. The course covered detailed procedures for cleaning, maintaining, and troubleshooting the M16A4 rifle and M9 pistol that were standard issue for Fort Braxton trainees. The instruction was highly technical, requiring recruits to memorize complex disassembly and reassembly procedures while understanding the mechanical principles behind proper weapons maintenance. Instructor Staff Sergeant Michael Chen had taught weapons maintenance for over a decade and had developed an eye for spotting recruits who would excel in technical military specialties. He typically expected new recruits to struggle with the precision required for proper weapons maintenance, as most civilian backgrounds provided little preparation for such detailed mechanical work. Sarah's performance during weapons maintenance training immediately caught Chen's attention. She disassembled her rifle with smooth, efficient movements that spoke of extensive prior experience. Her identification of potential malfunction points was accurate and comprehensive. Most impressively, when Chen introduced a deliberately damaged firing pin into one of the training weapons to test diagnostic skills, Sarah identified the problem within seconds of beginning her inspection. During a brief break in the training, Chen pulled Sarah aside for a brief conversation. "Martinez," he said, "you've handled these weapons before. Your familiarity level is way beyond what we typically see from civilian recruits. Mind if I ask where you learned weapons maintenance?" Sarah's response was polite but evasive. "I've always been interested in mechanical systems, Sergeant. I suppose I pick things up quickly when I'm motivated to learn." Chen accepted her explanation, but noted the carefully neutral way she avoided directly answering his question about prior experience. That evening, Chen joined Torres and Williams for an informal discussion about Sarah's performance across different training modules. All three instructors had noticed competencies that seemed inconsistent with her official background, and they were beginning to suspect that there were significant gaps in what they knew about her pre-military experience. The medical skills could be explained by EMT training or volunteer work, Torres suggested. But the weapons knowledge suggests something more formal. She handles firearms like someone who's had professional training, not just casual recreational shooting. Williams agreed, adding, "Her tactical thinking during field exercises is also advanced. She anticipates problems and thinks several steps ahead in ways that usually take months or years of military training to develop. Either she's exceptionally gifted or she's had experiences that aren't in her file." The three instructors decided to request additional background verification from the recruitment office, though they acknowledged that some relevant experiences might not appear in official records. Veterans sometimes entered military service after careers in law enforcement or private security, and such backgrounds could account for many of the skills Sarah had demonstrated. Meanwhile, Sarah was becoming increasingly aware that her performance was drawing attention from the training staff. She had worked hard to remain unremarkable during her early weeks at Fort Braxton, but the specialized training modules required her to demonstrate skills that were difficult to hide or downplay. She found herself in the uncomfortable position of trying to excel at her military training while avoiding questions about how she had acquired relevant prior experience. The social dynamics within Sarah's unit continued to evolve as training progressed into more advanced phases. Her consistently strong performance and willingness to help struggling unit members had earned respect from most of her fellow recruits, but it had also created some resentment among those who felt inadequate by comparison. Private Jake Morrison, a recruit from rural Texas who had struggled with the academic aspects of training, began making comments about Sarah that carried undertones of suspicion and resentment. During evening discussions in the barracks, Morrison would make remarks like, "Some people seem to know an awful lot for somebody who's supposed to be learning this stuff for the first time," or "must be nice to have all the answers when the rest of us are figuring things out the hard way." These comments created tension within the unit, as other recruits were divided between appreciation for Sarah's competence and discomfort with Morrison's implications that she might be hiding something significant about her background. Marcus Johnson attempted to address the growing tension by organizing informal study groups, where stronger performers could help those who were struggling, but Morrison's resentment seemed to extend beyond mere academic competition. The situation came to a head during a particularly challenging week that included both written examinations and practical field exercises. The academic testing covered military history, tactics, regulations, and technical procedures from all their training modules. The practical exercises tested their ability to apply what they had learned under simulated combat conditions while maintaining unit cohesion and following proper protocols. Sarah's performance during this testing period was outstanding across all areas. Her written exam scores placed her at the top of her unit, and her practical exercise performance demonstrated mastery of both individual skills and team leadership. However, her success seemed to intensify rather than resolve the tensions that had been building within the group. Morrison's criticism became more direct and personal after the test results were announced. During evening chow, he loudly questioned how someone with Sarah's supposed background could perform so well without having some unfair advantage or prior knowledge. His comments suggested that Sarah might be receiving special treatment from instructors, or that she had somehow obtained advance information about test content. The accusations were serious enough that other unit members felt compelled to respond. Jennifer Walsh pointed out that Sarah had been helpful to everyone in the unit and had never displayed any behavior suggesting dishonesty or unfair advantage. Tommy Richardson added that Sarah had actually helped him study for the examinations and had shared knowledge freely with anyone who asked for assistance. Marcus Johnson decided to address the situation directly. "Morrison," he said, "whatever Sarah's background is, she's earned her performance through hard work and skill. She's been nothing but helpful to this unit, and your accusations are starting to hurt unit morale. We need to focus on supporting each other, not tearing each other down." Morrison's response was angry and defensive. "Easy for you to say when you're not the one struggling to keep up with someone who clearly has training that the rest of us don't have. She's making the rest of us look bad, and I think we have a right to know why she's so much better prepared than everyone else." The confrontation attracted the attention of Staff Sergeant Williams, who quickly intervened to prevent the situation from escalating further. He separated Morrison from the rest of the unit and had a private conversation with him about appropriate behavior toward fellow recruits. However, Williams was also forced to acknowledge that Morrison's suspicions about Sarah's background were not entirely unreasonable, given the pattern of advanced competencies she had displayed. That night, Williams made the decision to formally request an expanded background check on Sarah Martinez from the recruitment office. While he had no evidence of any wrongdoing or deception on Sarah's part, the questions about her prior experience were becoming disruptive to unit morale and needed to be resolved. He also decided to have a direct conversation with Sarah about her background, hoping that a straightforward discussion might provide clarity without requiring formal investigation. The next morning, Williams called Sarah to his office for what he described as a routine individual assessment meeting. Such meetings were standard procedure during training, providing opportunities for instructors to give personalized feedback and address any concerns that recruits might have about their military preparation. Sarah entered Williams's office with the same calm composure she displayed in most situations, but Williams noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture that suggested she might be anticipating difficult questions. He decided to begin with positive feedback about her performance before addressing the more sensitive questions about her background. "Martinez," Williams began, "your performance during training has been consistently excellent across all areas. Your test scores, practical skills, and leadership potential all suggest that you'll be a valuable addition to whatever unit you're assigned to after completing basic training. Your instructors have been impressed with your competence and professionalism." Sarah thanked him for the positive feedback, but Williams could see that she was waiting for the more challenging part of their conversation. He decided to address his concerns directly, rather than drawing out the tension. "That said," Williams continued, "several instructors have noted that your skill level in certain areas suggests prior experience that isn't reflected in your recruitment file. Your medical knowledge, weapons familiarity, and tactical thinking all seem more advanced than what we typically see from civilian recruits. I'm hoping you can help me understand what experiences have prepared you so well for military training." Sarah was quiet for several moments before responding, and Williams could see her carefully considering how much information to share. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a seriousness that suggested the conversation was entering territory she found difficult to navigate. "Sergeant," Sarah said, "I understand why my performance raises questions. I can assure you that I haven't received any unfair advantages or special training specifically for military service. Whatever skills I have come from, experiences that I prefer to keep private, but nothing that would compromise my integrity as a recruit or my commitment to military service." Williams appreciated her directness, but found her response raised more questions than it answered. "Martinez, I'm not questioning your integrity or commitment, but the level of competence you've displayed suggests experiences that could be relevant to your military career development. Understanding your background could help us provide better guidance about specializations that might be appropriate for you." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the reasonableness of his position while clearly struggling with how much personal information to share. "I understand your perspective, Sergeant. If you need additional background verification, I'm willing to cooperate with any official inquiries. I just ask that you understand there are aspects of my past that are painful for me to discuss, and that I hope military service might help me move beyond." Williams recognized the signs of someone dealing with potentially traumatic experiences and decided not to push for immediate answers. Military service often attracted people who were seeking fresh starts or escape from difficult circumstances, and he had learned that forcing such discussions rarely produced positive results. "I appreciate your honesty," Williams said. "We'll proceed with standard background verification procedures, but in the meantime, I want you to know that your performance has been exemplary, and your commitment to this unit is valued. If there are support resources you need to address any personal issues, please don't hesitate to ask." As Sarah left Williams's office, both she and her training supervisor understood that questions about her background would likely persist until they could be formally resolved. However, Williams had also gained respect for the way Sarah handled difficult questions with honesty and dignity, even when discussing obviously sensitive personal territory. The expanded background check that Staff Sergeant Williams requested would take several weeks to complete, but military training schedules wait for no administrative processes. Sarah's unit was approaching the halfway point of their basic training program, which meant the introduction of more advanced tactical exercises and increased physical demands designed to prepare them for potential combat deployment. The 7th week of training brought the first extended field exercise, a 4-day simulation that would test everything the recruits had learned while requiring them to operate with minimal sleep, limited food, and constant pressure from their instructors. The exercise was designed to simulate some of the stress and uncertainty that soldiers might face in actual combat situations, pushing recruits beyond their comfort zones to identify those who could maintain performance under extreme conditions. Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of Fort Braxton, made an unusual decision to personally observe portions of this field exercise. Colonel Harrison was a 30-year veteran who had commanded units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other deployment zones throughout his career. His reputation for identifying exceptional soldiers was legendary throughout the military community, and his presence during training exercises was considered both an honor and an additional source of pressure for the recruits involved. The field exercise began before dawn on a Monday morning with a forced march carrying full equipment loads. The recruits would cover 15 miles through varied terrain before establishing a temporary base camp where they would spend the next 3 days conducting tactical operations under simulated combat conditions. Weather conditions were deliberately challenging, with cold rain and strong winds adding to the physical demands of the exercise. Sarah's performance during the forced march was steady and unremarkable for the first several miles. She maintained proper formation, kept pace with the unit, and showed no signs of the fatigue that was beginning to affect some of her fellow recruits. However, as the march progressed and conditions became more challenging, her superior conditioning and mental toughness became increasingly apparent. When Private Morrison began showing signs of heat exhaustion despite the cold weather conditions, Sarah was among the first to recognize the symptoms and take appropriate action. She quietly redistributed some of his equipment weight among willing unit members and ensured he maintained proper hydration without making his struggles obvious to the observing instructors. Her intervention was subtle but effective, allowing Morrison to complete the march without requiring medical intervention that could have resulted in his removal from the exercise. The assistance Sarah provided to Morrison was particularly notable, given his previous antagonism toward her, but she treated his distress as simply another problem requiring practical solution rather than an opportunity to settle personal scores. Her response demonstrated the kind of leadership and unit loyalty that military training was designed to develop, but which often took much longer to emerge in new recruits. Colonel Harrison, observing from a vehicle that paralleled the march route, took note of the incident and made inquiries about the recruit who had provided assistance. When informed that it was the same Martinez who had been generating questions about advanced competencies, he requested that staff pay particular attention to her performance throughout the remainder of the exercise. The base camp establishment phase of the exercise tested the recruits' ability to work together under time pressure, while following proper security protocols. The unit was required to establish defensive positions, communications equipment, and basic living facilities within a limited time frame, while maintaining constant readiness for simulated enemy contact. Sarah's contributions during base camp establishment were decisive and professional. She demonstrated familiarity with military communications equipment that went beyond what had been covered in their basic training, efficiently establishing radio contacts with control elements and maintaining clear communication protocols. Her work with defensive positioning showed tactical thinking that impressed the observing instructors as she identified optimal fields of fire and potential weak points in their perimeter without requiring guidance from training staff. More impressively, Sarah seemed to anticipate logistical challenges before they became problems. She identified potential drainage issues in the camp layout that could have become serious problems if the rain continued, and she suggested modifications to their supply storage procedures that prevented equipment damage and maintained organization under difficult conditions. Staff Sergeant Chen, who was one of several instructors embedded with the unit during the exercise, began documenting Sarah's performance in detail. Her competencies continued to exceed what military training typically produced, and her ability to function effectively under stress suggested experiences that would be valuable for the training program to understand and potentially replicate with other recruits. The tactical operation phases of the exercise required the unit to conduct simulated patrols, reconnaissance missions, and defensive operations while being evaluated on their ability to work together as a cohesive fighting force. These exercises were deliberately designed to be confusing and stressful, with changing objectives, incomplete information, and time pressures that forced recruits to make decisions with limited data. During a particularly challenging nighttime patrol exercise, Sarah's unit was tasked with gathering intelligence about simulated enemy positions while avoiding detection by opposing forces played by advanced training personnel. The exercise required them to move through unfamiliar terrain in complete darkness, while maintaining communication and achieving specific objectives within strict time limits. Sarah volunteered to serve as point person for the patrol, a responsibility that required her to lead the unit through dangerous terrain while watching for potential threats and obstacles. Her performance in this role was outstanding, demonstrating land navigation skills and situational awareness that allowed the unit to complete their mission efficiently while avoiding all the detection scenarios that had been set up to test their tactical abilities. What most impressed the observing instructors was Sarah's ability to communicate effectively with her unit members through subtle hand signals and whispered instructions that maintained operational security while ensuring everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. Her leadership during the patrol was natural and confident, suggesting command experience that was difficult to explain given her official background as a civilian recruit. Colonel Harrison chose to observe the nighttime patrol exercise personally, using night vision equipment to monitor the unit's performance from a concealed position. He watched Sarah lead her team through the exercise with professional competence that caught his attention immediately. Her movements were deliberate and efficient. Her communication with team members was clear and precise, and her tactical decision-making showed sophisticated understanding of military principles that typically required years of experience to develop. After the patrol exercise concluded successfully, Colonel Harrison requested a briefing from the training staff about Sarah's background and performance. The information provided only deepened his curiosity, as the gap between her official civilian status and her demonstrated military competences was unlike anything he had encountered in decades of military service. The third day of the field exercise included individual skills testing that required each recruit to demonstrate proficiency in areas such as marksmanship, first aid, communications, and tactical problem-solving under stress. These individual assessments were designed to identify specific strengths and weaknesses that could guide future training and career development decisions. Sarah's performance during individual skills testing was exceptional across all evaluated areas. Her marksmanship scores were among the highest recorded for civilian recruits in recent years. Her first aid practical examination was performed with medical precision that suggested extensive prior training. Her communications work demonstrated familiarity with equipment and protocols that exceeded basic training curriculum. Most notably, her tactical problem-solving responses showed creative thinking and strategic awareness that impressed even the most experienced evaluators. The weapons testing portion of the individual skills assessment provided the most dramatic demonstration of Sarah's unusual competencies. The test required recruits to engage targets at various ranges using different weapons systems while dealing with simulated equipment malfunctions and changing tactical scenarios. Most recruits struggled with the complexity and time pressures involved, but Sarah moved through the exercise with professional confidence that set her apart from her peers. During one particularly challenging scenario that simulated a weapons malfunction requiring immediate field repair, Sarah diagnosed and corrected the problem with speed and accuracy that surprised the test administrators. Her familiarity with weapons systems and maintenance procedures was clearly beyond what basic training provided, and her performance under pressure suggested extensive practical experience with firearms in stressful situations. Sergeant Torres, who was observing the individual testing as part of her evaluation responsibilities, found Sarah's medical skills demonstration equally impressive. The test required recruits to respond to multiple simulated casualties with various types of injuries while operating under time pressure and resource limitations. Sarah's triage decisions were medically sound, her treatment procedures were technically correct, and her ability to prioritize multiple patients showed clinical experience that was difficult to explain. After completing her individual skills testing, Sarah was approached by Colonel Harrison for an informal conversation about her performance and background. The colonel's presence was unusual enough that other recruits took notice, adding to the growing awareness that Sarah's capabilities were attracting high-level attention from the training command. Colonel Harrison's conversation with Sarah was brief but direct. "Martinez," he said,
"Your performance during this exercise has been outstanding.
"your skills and leadership capabilities suggest significant prior experience that could be valuable for specific military career paths. I'd like to understand what background has prepared you so well for military service." Sarah's response maintained the same respectful but guarded tone she had used with Staff Sergeant Williams. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the positive evaluation. I've always been interested in military service and have tried to prepare myself as well as possible. I hope to continue learning and contributing to whatever unit I'm assigned to after training." Colonel Harrison appreciated her professionalism, but he also recognized evasiveness when he encountered it. "Martinez, exceptional performance like yours often comes from experiences that could help us improve our training programs or identify appropriate specialization opportunities. If there are aspects of your background that have contributed to your preparation, sharing that information could benefit both your career development and our ability to help other recruits." Sarah considered her response carefully before speaking. "Sir, I understand the value of that information for training purposes. I'm willing to cooperate with any official inquiries about my background. I would just request understanding that some experiences are difficult for me to discuss casually, and that I enlisted seeking opportunities to move forward rather than dwelling on the past." The colonel nodded, recognizing the signs of someone dealing with potentially traumatic experiences. His decades of military service had taught him to distinguish between recruits who were hiding something problematic and those who were simply reluctant to discuss painful personal history. "I respect your position, Martinez," Harrison said. "Your performance speaks for itself, and your commitment to military service is obvious. We'll proceed with appropriate background verification, but I want you to know that your contributions to this exercise have been exemplary, and your potential for military leadership is clearly significant." As the field exercise concluded and the unit prepared to return to Fort Braxton, Sarah found herself reflecting on the increased attention her performance was generating. While she was proud of her success in military training, she was also aware that her competencies were raising questions that would eventually require more complete answers than she had been willing to provide. The other members of her unit had also taken notice of the attention Sarah was receiving from senior training staff. Marcus Johnson approached her during the return march to express his appreciation for her leadership during the exercise and to acknowledge that her performance had elevated the entire unit's success. Jennifer Walsh commented that Sarah's tactical skills and military bearings suggested someone who belonged in advanced leadership training rather than basic recruitment. Even Private Morrison, whose earlier antagonism had been replaced by grudging respect after Sarah's assistance during the forced march, acknowledged that her contributions had been valuable to the unit's success. The field exercise had demonstrated that whatever Sarah's background might be, her commitment to her fellow soldiers and her competence as a military professional were beyond question. The bus ride back to Fort Braxton was quieter than usual as the recruits processed their experiences from the challenging 4-day exercise. Sarah spent much of the journey considering how much longer she could avoid detailed discussions about her background and whether military service would ultimately provide the fresh start she was seeking or simply create new complications related to her past experiences. Staff Sergeant Williams spent the return journey reviewing notes from all the instructors who had observed the field exercise, compiling a comprehensive assessment of Sarah's performance that would be forwarded to both the recruitment office and Colonel Harrison's command staff. The documentation painted a picture of a recruit with exceptional potential and mysterious preparation that warranted further investigation and careful career development planning. The weeks following the field exercise brought intensified scrutiny of Sarah's background as military bureaucracy slowly processed the expanded background check that Staff Sergeant Williams had requested. Meanwhile, training continued with advanced modules designed to prepare recruits for specialized military career tracks and potential deployment scenarios. The atmosphere within Sarah's unit had shifted significantly since the field exercise, with most of her fellow recruits now viewing her as an unofficial leader whose competence could be counted on during challenging situations. Colonel Harrison had made the unusual decision to take personal interest in Sarah's case, assigning his aide, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, to expedite the background verification process and coordinate with various agencies that might have relevant information about Sarah's prior experiences. Captain Rodriguez was an experienced intelligence officer who specialized in personnel security investigations, and her involvement indicated that Sarah's case was being treated as potentially significant rather than merely curious. The advanced training modules that began in the 8th week included specialized instruction in areas such as advanced tactical operations, military intelligence procedures, and leadership development. These courses were designed to identify recruits who showed potential for specialized career paths within the military and performance during these modules would influence assignment decisions after basic training completion. During the Advanced Tactical Operations course, Sarah's performance continued to distinguish her from other recruits in ways that suggested extensive prior experience with military or law enforcement procedures. The course covered topics such as close quarters combat, tactical movement, and coordination of complex operations involving multiple personnel and equipment systems. Most recruits approach these subjects as entirely new material, requiring careful study and repeated practice to achieve basic competency. Sarah's approach to advanced tactical training was markedly different from her peers. Her movement techniques demonstrated familiarity with tactical principles that typically required months or years of specialized training to master. Her understanding of field-of-fire concepts, cover and concealment principles, and coordination of team movements suggested hands-on experience with tactical operations rather than mere academic study of military procedures. The course instructor, Master Sergeant David Kim, was a 25-year veteran who had served with special operations units throughout his career. His experience with advanced military personnel gave him sophisticated appreciation for the difference between academic knowledge and practical expertise, and Sarah's performance clearly indicated the latter rather than the former. During a particularly complex exercise that required coordinating movement of multiple personnel through a simulated hostile environment, Sarah demonstrated command presence and tactical judgment that impressed even Master Sergeant Kim. She effectively managed the movements of 6 team members through a scenario involving multiple threats and changing objectives, making split-second decisions that kept her team safe while accomplishing their assigned mission. What distinguished Sarah's leadership during this exercise was not just her tactical competence, but her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, while maintaining clear communication with team members who were experiencing high levels of stress. Her instructions were precise and timely. Her situation assessment was accurate and comprehensive, and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. After the exercise concluded, Master Sergeant Kim approached Sarah for a private conversation about her performance and background. Kim had worked with some of the most elite soldiers in the military, and Sarah's competencies were reminiscent of personnel with extensive special operations or law enforcement experience rather than civilian recruits undergoing basic military training. Martinez, Kim said, "Your performance during that exercise was exceptional. Your tactical awareness and command presence suggest significant prior experience with high-stress operations. I'm curious about what background has prepared you for this level of tactical competence." Sarah's response maintained her characteristic professionalism while avoiding specific details about her experiences. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. I've always been interested in tactical procedures and have studied military operations extensively. I try to learn from every training opportunity and apply whatever knowledge I can to help my unit succeed." Kim appreciated her dedication to learning, but his experienced eye told him that Sarah's competencies went far beyond academic study or natural talent. "Martinez, the level of skill you've demonstrated suggests hands-on experience with tactical operations. That kind of background could be very valuable for specialized military career paths, and it would help your training development if we understood what experiences you're drawing from." Sarah considered her response carefully, clearly struggling with how much information to share while maintaining the privacy boundaries she had established. "Master Sergeant, I understand the value of that information for career planning purposes. I'm willing to cooperate with official background verification processes, but I hope you can understand that some experiences are difficult for me to discuss in detail." Kim nodded, recognizing the signs of someone dealing with potentially traumatic or sensitive experiences. His years of military service had taught him that exceptional soldiers often came from challenging backgrounds, and that pushing for immediate disclosure rarely produced positive results. The Military Intelligence Procedures course that followed advanced tactical training provided additional evidence of Sarah's unusual preparation for military service. The course covered topics such as information gathering, threat assessment, surveillance techniques, and analysis of intelligence data. These subjects required specific analytical skills and familiarity with intelligence concepts that most civilian recruits found challenging to master. Sarah's performance during intelligence training was consistently outstanding across all evaluated areas. Her understanding of intelligence gathering principles was sophisticated and practical rather than merely theoretical. Her analysis of complex scenarios demonstrated ability to identify relevant patterns and draw appropriate conclusions from limited data. Most notably, her familiarity with surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques suggested prior experience with intelligence operations or law enforcement activities. The course instructor, Captain Jennifer Barnes, was an intelligence officer with extensive field experience who had worked in various deployment zones throughout her military career. Her expertise in personnel assessment made her particularly qualified to evaluate recruits for potential intelligence career specializations, and Sarah's performance clearly indicated exceptional aptitude for intelligence work. During a practical exercise that required analysis of simulated intelligence data to identify potential threats and recommend appropriate responses, Sarah produced work that demonstrated professional-level competence in intelligence analysis. Her written assessment was comprehensive, well-organized, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of threat evaluation principles that typically required extensive specialized training to develop. Captain Barnes was sufficiently impressed with Sarah's performance to request a meeting with Colonel Harrison to discuss her potential for advanced intelligence training. Sarah's combination of tactical competence, analytical skills, and demonstrated leadership abilities suggested she could be valuable for specialized military career paths that required extensive background verification and security clearance approval. Meanwhile, the expanded background check that had been initiated several weeks earlier was beginning to produce preliminary results that raised more questions than they answered. Captain Rodriguez had coordinated with multiple agencies, including the FBI, state police organizations, and various federal databases, but the results were indicating significant gaps in Sarah's documented history that were unusual for someone of her age and apparent experience level. The background check had confirmed basic biographical information such as Sarah's birth date, educational background, and employment history, but there were substantial periods of time that were not accounted for by official records. Most concerning was a 2-year gap in documented activity during which Sarah appeared to have had no official employment, educational enrollment, or other traceable activities that would normally be reflected in background verification databases. Captain Rodriguez presented her preliminary findings to Colonel Harrison during a confidential briefing that highlighted the unusual aspects of Sarah's background verification. The gaps in documented history, combined with her demonstrated competencies in tactical operations and intelligence analysis, suggested experiences that were either highly classified or potentially problematic from a security perspective. The background check results are inconsistent with what we're observing in her training performance, Rodriguez explained. Her competencies suggest extensive professional training in military or law enforcement procedures, but there's no record of such training in any accessible databases. Either there are classified aspects to her background that we don't have clearance to access, or her experiences came from sources outside normal government channels. Colonel Harrison reviewed the documentation carefully. Considering the implications of the background check results for Sarah's continued military service and potential career development, the combination of exceptional performance and mysterious background created a complex situation that required careful handling to ensure both security requirements and fair treatment of a promising recruit. "What's your assessment of her security risk profile?" Harrison asked Rodriguez. "Are there indicators suggesting potential problems with loyalty, reliability, or other security concerns that would disqualify her from military service?" Rodriguez considered her response carefully. Her behavior and performance suggest strong commitment to military service and unit loyalty. She's demonstrated willingness to help fellow soldiers even at personal cost, and her leadership during training has been exemplary. The background gaps are concerning from a security perspective, but there are no specific indicators suggesting disloyalty or security risks. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Continue the background verification process, but also arrange for a more comprehensive interview with Martinez. Given her performance and potential value to military service, I want to give her an opportunity to provide additional context about her background before making any decisions about her continued training or career development. The comprehensive interview was scheduled for the following week, allowing Sarah time to prepare for what she understood would be a detailed discussion about her background and experiences. The interview would be conducted by Captain Rodriguez, with oversight from Colonel Harrison, and Sarah was informed that the session would be recorded and would require her to provide more complete information about her prior experiences than she had shared in previous conversations. Sarah spent considerable time preparing for the interview, knowing that her military career would likely depend on her willingness to share information about experiences she had hoped to leave behind. The prospect of detailed disclosure about her background created significant anxiety, but she also recognized that her exceptional performance during training had created expectations that required explanation. The night before the scheduled interview, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to military service and considering whether the fresh start she had sought was achievable if it required comprehensive disclosure of experiences she had spent years trying to overcome. Her fellow recruits had come to depend on her leadership and competence, and she felt responsibility to them as well as to her own future, to handle the interview in a way that preserved her opportunity to continue military service. Marcus Johnson approached Sarah that evening to express support from the entire unit for whatever she might be facing in terms of background verification. The other recruits had noticed the increased attention she was receiving from senior training staff, and while they didn't know the specific details, they wanted her to know that her contributions to their unit were valued and appreciated. "Whatever your story is," Marcus told her, "you've proven yourself as a soldier and a leader. You've had our backs throughout training, and we want you to know that you have our support now. We hope you get through whatever bureaucratic process you're dealing with and can continue to serve with us." Jennifer Walsh and Tommy Richardson echoed similar sentiments, with Jennifer adding, "You've demonstrated competence and leadership that this military needs. Whatever experiences you've had that prepared you for service, they've clearly made you into someone who makes everyone around you better soldiers." Sarah was deeply moved by the support from her fellow recruits, and their confidence in her value as a soldier strengthened her resolve to approach the comprehensive interview with honesty and openness, regardless of the personal discomfort involved in discussing her background. The evening before the interview, Staff Sergeant Williams met with Sarah to provide guidance about the interview process and to express his own support for her continued military service. Williams had observed Sarah's development as a soldier and leader throughout training, and he wanted to ensure she understood that the background verification process was intended to support her career development rather than to create obstacles to her military service. "Martinez," Williams said, "your performance during training has been exceptional, and your potential for military leadership is obvious to everyone who's worked with you. The interview process is designed to help us understand how to best utilize your skills and provide appropriate career development opportunities. Honesty about your background will serve you better than continued evasiveness, regardless of what experiences you've had." Sarah appreciated Williams's guidance and support, and his words helped her approach the upcoming interview with confidence that her military service could continue if she was willing to provide the information that the training command needed to make appropriate decisions about her career development and security clearance requirements. The morning of Sarah's comprehensive interview arrived with unseasonably warm weather that seemed to mirror the intensity of the situation she was about to face. Captain Rodriguez had arranged for the interview to take place in Colonel Harrison's private conference room, a space typically reserved for classified briefings and sensitive personnel discussions. The formal setting emphasized the importance that the command structure was placing on understanding Sarah's background and determining her future within the military. Sarah arrived for the interview 15 minutes early, dressed in her best uniform, with all insignia properly positioned and boots polished to regulation standards. Her appearance reflected the attention to detail and military bearing that had characterized her performance throughout training, but those who knew her well would have noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture that suggested the emotional difficulty of what she was about to undertake. Colonel Harrison began the interview by acknowledging Sarah's exceptional performance during training and emphasizing that the background verification process was intended to support her military career rather than create obstacles to her continued service. His tone was professional but supportive, designed to encourage honesty while maintaining the formal structure required for an official personnel investigation. "Martinez," Colonel Harrison began, "your performance during basic training has been outstanding across all evaluated areas. Your leadership capabilities, tactical competence, and commitment to your unit are exactly what the military needs in its future leaders. The purpose of today's interview is to better understand the experiences that have prepared you so well for military service, so that we can provide appropriate career development opportunities and ensure proper security clearance processing." Sarah thanked him for the positive assessment and expressed her willingness to cooperate fully with the interview process. However, she also requested permission to provide some context before answering specific questions about her background, explaining that her experiences were both painful to discuss and potentially difficult for others to understand without proper explanation. "Sir," Sarah said, "I appreciate the opportunity to clarify my background, and I understand the importance of complete honesty for military service. I would like to request permission to explain the overall context of my experiences before answering specific questions, as I believe that context will help you understand both my qualifications for military service and my reluctance to discuss these matters casually." Colonel Harrison agreed to her request, and Captain Rodriguez activated the recording equipment while noting the time and participants for official documentation. Sarah took a moment to collect her thoughts before beginning what would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Sarah began her explanation by describing her childhood in a military family, with a father who was a career army officer and a mother who worked as a military nurse. Her early exposure to military culture and values had instilled in her a deep appreciation for military service, and she had always assumed she would eventually pursue a military career following her father's example. However, Sarah's path to military service had been complicated by family circumstances that had required her to postpone her military ambitions. When she was 17 years old, her father had been killed in a training accident at Fort Benning, and her mother had struggled with depression and substance abuse problems that made it impossible for Sarah to leave home for military service immediately after high school. Instead of pursuing immediate military enlistment, Sarah had remained home to care for her mother while working various jobs to support their household. The responsibility of managing her mother's medical and financial problems had required her to mature quickly and develop problem-solving skills that would later prove valuable during military training. The situation with her mother had deteriorated progressively over several years, culminating in a series of incidents that had brought them to the attention of local law enforcement and social services. Sarah's mother had been involved in domestic violence situations with various partners, and Sarah had frequently found herself serving as an intermediary between her mother and both police officers and medical personnel responding to emergency calls. These experiences had given Sarah extensive exposure to crisis management, medical emergency procedures, and law enforcement protocols. She had received informal training from EMT personnel who responded to frequent calls at their residence, and she had developed working relationships with police officers who appreciated her ability to de-escalate volatile situations involving her mother and her various unstable relationships. When Sarah was 20 years old, her mother had died from a drug overdose that may or may not have been intentional. The death had left Sarah emotionally devastated, but also free for the first time in years to pursue her own goals rather than managing her mother's problems. However, the years of dealing with family crisis had left her uncertain about her own identity and reluctant to discuss experiences that had been both traumatic and intensely private. Following her mother's death, Sarah had spent nearly 2 years working through her grief while trying to determine what direction her life should take. During this period, she had volunteered with several organizations that served military families and veterans, finding that her experiences with crisis management and her understanding of military culture made her valuable in helping other families deal with various difficulties. Her volunteer work had included serving as a victim advocate with local police departments, providing crisis counseling for domestic violence situations, and working with emergency medical services during major incidents that required coordination of multiple response agencies. These experiences had given her advanced training in areas such as tactical communications, emergency medical procedures, and crisis intervention techniques that closely paralleled military training curricula. Sarah had also spent considerable time during this period studying military history, tactics, and procedures as a way of honoring her father's memory and preparing for eventual military service. Her academic study had been supplemented by practical experience with firearms through training programs designed for law enforcement and military personnel, and she had achieved instructor-level certification in several weapon systems. The decision to pursue military enlistment had ultimately been motivated by her desire to transform her difficult experiences into something positive while honoring her father's legacy of military service. She had viewed military service as an opportunity to use her hard-won skills in crisis management and tactical operations to serve her country while building a career that provided stability and purpose. However, Sarah had been reluctant to discuss her background in detail because she was concerned that her experiences with family dysfunction and her mother's substance abuse problems might be viewed as security risks or character flaws that would disqualify her from military service. She had also found it emotionally difficult to revisit experiences that represented some of the most painful periods of her life. "The skills that have served me well during training," Sarah explained, "came from years of dealing with family crisis situations that required me to remain calm under pressure, think tactically about complex problems, and coordinate with various emergency response agencies. The medical knowledge, weapons familiarity, and crisis management abilities that have impressed my instructors all come from real-world experiences that I gained while trying to keep my family together and deal with law enforcement and medical emergencies." Colonel Harrison and Captain Rodriguez listened to Sarah's explanation with growing understanding of how her background had prepared her for military service while also explaining her reluctance to discuss personal details. Her experiences, while painful, clearly demonstrated the kind of character and competence that the military valued, and her motivation for pursuing military service was exactly the kind of commitment that the service sought in its personnel. Captain Rodriguez asked several follow-up questions to clarify specific aspects of Sarah's background and to verify details that could be confirmed through official records. The volunteer work and training certifications that Sarah described were documented through various agencies, and her academic achievements could be verified through educational institutions she had attended. More importantly, Sarah's explanation provided context for understanding her performance during military training that made sense of previously confusing competencies. Her tactical awareness came from years of dealing with potentially violent domestic situations. Her medical skills had been developed through extensive interaction with emergency medical personnel. Her leadership abilities had been tested in real-world crisis situations that were more stressful than most military training scenarios. Colonel Harrison concluded the interview by expressing appreciation for Sarah's honesty and acknowledging the courage required to share such personal and painful information for the purpose of clarifying her military qualifications.
He assured her that her background would be viewed as preparation for military service rather than as problematic history that might disqualify her from continued training.
Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, "Your background explains both your exceptional preparation for military service and your reluctance to discuss personal experiences.
The skills you've demonstrated and the character you've shown are exactly what the military needs, and your motivation for service honors both your father's legacy and your own commitment to using difficult experiences to serve something greater than yourself." Following the interview, Colonel Harrison and Captain Rodriguez spent considerable time discussing the implications of Sarah's background for her military career development and security clearance processing. Her experiences, while unconventional, clearly demonstrated the kind of resilience and competence that the military valued, and her performance during training suggested significant potential for advanced leadership positions. The verification of Sarah's background proceeded quickly once the specific details of her experiences were available for investigation. Her volunteer work with law enforcement and emergency services was well documented and had earned positive recommendations from supervising personnel, who praised her reliability, competence, and commitment to helping others during difficult situations. Within 2 weeks of the comprehensive interview, Sarah received notification that her background verification had been completed successfully and that she was approved for continued military service, with eligibility for advanced training programs and security clearance processing. The notification included a commendation from Colonel Harrison acknowledging her exceptional performance during basic training and recommending her for leadership development programs. More importantly for Sarah personally, the interview process had provided an opportunity to transform her painful experiences into recognized preparation for military service. The validation of her skills and character by senior military officers helped her understand that her difficult past had prepared her for meaningful contribution to military service rather than representing obstacles to be overcome. The response from her fellow recruits when they learned that Sarah's background verification had been completed successfully was overwhelmingly positive. Marcus Johnson organized an informal celebration in the barracks to express the unit's relief and happiness that Sarah would be continuing her military career with them. Jennifer Walsh commented that understanding Sarah's background made her respect for Sarah's achievements even greater, as she recognized the courage required to overcome difficult family circumstances while developing the skills that made her such an effective soldier. Even Private Morrison, whose earlier antagonism had been replaced by respect for Sarah's competence and character, approached her to express admiration for her perseverance through challenging circumstances and her commitment to using her experiences to serve others through military service. Staff Sergeant Williams met with Sarah privately to congratulate her on successfully completing the background verification process and to discuss potential career development opportunities that might be appropriate given her demonstrated competencies and leadership potential. Williams expressed particular satisfaction that Sarah had found the courage to share her background honestly, as he believed that openness about difficult experiences was essential for building the kind of trust required for effective military leadership. The final weeks of basic training proceeded smoothly for Sarah and her unit, with the successful resolution of questions about her background, allowing her to focus entirely on preparing for her next phase of military service. Her performance continued to be exceptional across all training areas, but the mystery that had previously surrounded her competencies had been replaced by understanding and respect for the experiences that had shaped her into an effective soldier. Sarah's tattoo, which had remained hidden throughout basic training, finally became visible during a medical examination required for graduation processing. The tattoo was a memorial design incorporating her father's military unit insignia, along with dates commemorating both his death and her mother's death, surrounded by text reading, "Honor through service," in military-style lettering. When Colonel Harrison saw the tattoo during a routine inspection, he immediately recognized the military unit insignia and realized that Sarah was the daughter of Captain Robert Martinez, a respected officer who had served under Harrison's command earlier in his career. The discovery provided final confirmation of Sarah's military heritage and explained the final aspects of her preparation for military service that had impressed her training staff. The revelation of Sarah's connection to Captain Martinez prompted Colonel Harrison to share with Sarah his memories of her father's service and to express his honor at having the opportunity to continue her father's legacy through her own military career. The conversation provided Sarah with closure about her father's impact on the military community and reinforced her sense that military service was both appropriate preparation for her future and fitting tribute to her family's military traditions. Sarah graduated from basic training as the honor graduate of her unit, recognized for exceptional performance across all training areas and outstanding leadership potential. Her graduation speech focused on the importance of using personal experiences, both positive and difficult, to strengthen commitment to serving others through military service. The recognition of Sarah's achievements during basic training led to assignment to advanced military leadership training with recommendations for specialized career tracks that would utilize her unique combination of tactical competence, crisis management experience, and demonstrated commitment to military values. Her story became part of Fort Braxton's tradition as an example of how diverse life experiences could prepare exceptional soldiers for military service when combined with proper character and commitment to serving others.